People assume I'm a patient man because I spend my life in a garage, leaning over the guts of a 1965 E-Type Jaguar with a pair of tweezers and a magnifying lamp. They see the steady hand and the quiet workspace, and they mistake it for peace. They think I'm harmless. In reality, I'm just accustomed to things being broken in ways that aren't immediately visible. A hairline fracture in a cylinder head doesn't announce itself with a bang. It waits for the right amount of pressure, the perfect temperature, and then it simply ceases to function. I've spent 20 years watching the rich bring me their ruin so I can make it look like it never happened. I am the man who erases the evidence of their mistakes. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. The air in the law office of Miller, Vance, and Associates was filtered to the point of being tasteless. It smelled of expensive toner and the kind of floor wax that costs more than my first truck. I sat in a chair that felt like it was designed to discourage slouching, keeping my spine straight and my hands folded in my lap. To my left, Landon was already checking his watch, the gold link of the band catching the overhead LED light. He looked like a man who was late for a very important lunch, his suit tailored to within an inch of its life. To my right, Sutton was vibrating with a sort of frantic, high-gloss energy, her fingers dancing across the screen of a phone she wasn't supposed to have out. We were here because the man who shared our last name was finally gone. The patriarch had exited the stage, leaving behind a wake of real estate holdings, silent partnerships, and 3 children who hadn't shared a meal in a decade. "Can we move this along?" Landon asked, not looking at me. He spoke to the mahogany door at the front of the room, as if he could command the attorney to appear through sheer willpower. "I have a flight to Aspen at 4. "I'm sure the snow will wait for you, Landon," I said. My voice was low, gravelly from years of breathing in shop dust and engine fumes. Sutton didn't look up from her phone. "Don't start, Sterling. Some of us actually have lives that require our presence. Not all of us can spend our Tuesday afternoons polishing chrome in a warehouse." "It's a restoration studio," I corrected mildly, "and it's how I pay for the things you like to borrow." She finally looked at me, her eyes narrowed. "Please, you're here for the same reason we are. Let's not pretend you're above the payout." The door opened before I could respond. Arthur Penhaligon walked in, looking exactly like a man who spent his days burying secrets under mountains of legalese. He carried a leather-bound folder that looked heavy enough to be a weapon. He didn't offer handshakes. He didn't offer condolences. He simply sat behind the desk, adjusted his spectacles, and looked at us like we were 3 different types of insurance claims. "Thank you for coming," Penhaligon said. He opened the folder. The paper crinkled, a sharp sound in the vacuum of the room. The estate of Harlan Brooks is complex, but his final directives regarding the primary assets were quite specific. I will skip the preamble and move directly to the distribution of the holdings. I watched Landon lean forward. He was hungry. He'd spent his life as a consultant, which was a polite way of saying he moved Harlan's money around to avoid taxes and called it a career. Sutton, meanwhile, was already mentally decorating a third home. They were the insiders. They were the ones who had attended the right parties, married the right pedigrees, and kept the Brooks name in the social registers while I stayed in the grease pits. Regarding the commercial real estate portfolio in the downtown district, Penhaligon read, his voice a flat monotone, and the residential developments currently held under the Brooks Umbrella Corporation. Harlan Brooks has stipulated that these assets are to be liquidated or transferred based on a tiered structure of familial contribution. Landon smirked. He knew that structure. He'd helped build it. "However," Penhaligon continued, his eyes shifting to a typed page further back in the file, "there is a primary clause that overrides the previous distributions. It concerns the status of the heirs." He cleared his throat. The silence in the room became heavy, the kind of atmospheric pressure that precedes a massive storm. I felt the familiar itch in my palms, the one I get when I know a machine is about to fail. The document states, "To my sons Landon and Sutton, I leave the sum of their accumulated debts and the forgiveness of all private loans issued by my office over the last 15 years. These amounts, totaling approximately $4 million each, shall constitute their full and final share of my worldly estate. They have lived on the future for long enough, now they may live on the past." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. Landon's face went from a pale ivory to a dull, mottled red. Sutton's phone slipped from her hand, thudding onto the thick carpet. "You're joking," Landon said. The polish was gone. His voice was thin and reedy. That's not an inheritance. That's a bill." "It is a settlement of obligations," Penhaligon corrected. Your father felt that the capital he provided during his life was your portion. He was very thorough in the accounting. Sutton was shaking her head, her perfectly manicured hair falling out of place. And Sterling, what does the fixer get? A set of wrenches? A kick out the door? She looked at me with a sneer that was fueled by pure, unadulterated panic. She wanted me to be lower than her. If she was sinking, she needed to know I was already underwater. Penhaligon turned a page. He looked at me for the first time. There was no sympathy in his eyes, only the professional detachment of a man delivering a verdict. Regarding Sterling Cross, the lawyer read, Harlan Brooks writes, to Sterling, who chose the grease of the shop over the silk of the boardroom, I leave the truth of his position. You have always functioned outside of this family. You have stayed in the margins, repairing the things we broke. Therefore, I see no reason to change your circumstances. You are not family in the eyes of this estate. You are a contractor. Your services are no longer required. The words hung in the air like exhaust fumes. You are not family. It was the public erasure they had always wanted. Landon and Sutton were ruined, yes, but they were still Brooks. I was being told I didn't even exist. I saw Landon's eyes dart toward me, a flash of nasty, desperate triumph flickering in his expression. He'd lost his fortune, but he'd gained the pleasure of seeing me cast out. So that's it? Landon spat, though he couldn't hide the tremor in his hands. We get nothing, and he gets told he's a stranger? The old man lost his mind at the end. He was of sound mind when this was drafted, Penhaligon said. I sat perfectly still. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. I felt the cold, familiar logic of the workshop take over. When a part is missing, you don't scream at the engine. You look at the schematic. You find the workaround. I looked at the lawyer, noticing the way his thumb was resting on the very edge of the leather folder, holding a small, separate slip of paper tucked into the back flap. Is that the end of it, Arthur? I asked. Landon groaned. Shut up, Sterling. You heard the man. You're a ghost. Go back to your garage and rot. Sutton was already on her feet, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. I'm contesting this. I'll hire the best team in the city. He can't just wipe us out like this. He was old. He was confused. Actually, Penhaligon interrupted, his voice cutting through her spiraling hysteria like a chilled blade. There is an addendum. It was filed 3 weeks ago during his final stay at the facility. It arrived via a private courier, witnessed and notarized by an outside firm. Landon froze. Sutton stayed mid-stride. An addendum? Landon whispered. What does it say? Penhaligon pulled the slip of paper from the back of the folder. He didn't read it immediately. He let the tension build until the air felt like it was humming. I watched him, my heart rate steady, my breathing rhythmic. I've waited 3 years for a part for a Ferrari GTO. I know how to wait. The addendum addresses the final disposal of the Brooks Trust, Penhaligon said, which includes the deed to the primary estate, the holding companies for the regional developments, and the liquid reserves held in the offshore accounts. He paused, his eyes moving over the text. A small, almost imperceptible frown creased his forehead. It says here, the entirety of the Brooks Trust, including all real estate and liquid assets not previously settled, is hereby transferred in full to a secondary beneficiary. Who? Sutton screamed. Who is it? Penhaligon looked at me, then back at the paper. The assets are transferred to Tabitha Reed. My daughter's name hit the room like a physical weight. Tabitha, 22 years old, finishing her degree, the only person in this entire orbit who had ever treated the old man like a human being instead of a vault. But, Penhaligon continued, his voice dropping an octave, as the beneficiary is currently of an age deemed transitional by the deceased, the trust is to be managed by a sole, irrevocable trustee. This trustee has total discretionary power over the funds, the properties, and the distributions. They cannot be removed by the beneficiary or any third party. Landon was leaning so far over the desk his tie was touching the mahogany. Who is the trustee, Arthur? Tell me it's the bank. Penhaligon looked at me. This time there was a flicker of something else in his gaze. It might have been respect. It might have been fear. The trustee is Sterling Cross. The silence returned, but the flavor had changed. It was no longer the silence of a funeral. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. I looked at Landon. I looked at Sutton. I saw the realization dawn on them. The realization that the man they had spent 40 years ignoring now held every cent of their potential future in his grease-stained hands. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I just felt the gears finally align. The machine was starting up, and for the first time in my life, I was the one with my hand on the throttle. I believe we're finished here, I said, standing up. The drive back to the shop was the quietest 30 minutes of my life. I didn't turn on the radio, I didn't take any calls, I simply navigated the mid-afternoon traffic with the mechanical precision of a man who knew exactly how much pressure it took to keep a vehicle in its lane. The rearview mirror, the glass towers of the city's financial district receded, shrinking into a cluster of silver needles against a flat gray sky. Landon and Sutton were back there somewhere, likely vibrating with a frantic, impotent energy, calling every lawyer who had ever billed the family name. I, on the other hand, was heading back to the smell of oil and the honest weight of steel. When I pulled into the industrial park, the gravel crunched beneath my tires with a satisfying, rhythmic sound. My shop was a nondescript warehouse on the edge of the district. No signage, no flair. Those who needed me knew where to find me. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of solvent and ancient leather. I sat at my workbench, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I didn't start working. I just looked at the folder Penhaligon had pressed into my hands as I left. The addendum was a masterpiece of legal engineering. It didn't just give me the keys, it built a wall around them. My father, a man who had spent his entire existence calculating the distance between people, had made one final, perfect calculation. He knew Landon's greed would make him predictable. He knew Sutton's vanity would make her fragile. And he knew that I was the only one who had the stomach to wait out the clock. The office phone rang at 4:15 p.m. I let it go to the machine. Landon's voice filled the small office space, distorted by the speaker. "Sterling, pick up. I know you're there. Don't think for 1 second this holds up. I've already spoken to the partners at Sterling and Howe. We're filing for an injunction by morning. You think you can just step out of the shadows and snatch 40 years of legacy? You're a mechanic, Sterling. You're a glorified janitor for cars. Give me a call before this gets ugly. You don't have the resources to fight us." I watched the tape spin on the machine. He sounded like a man who was falling from a great height and trying to convince the ground to move. I didn't call him back. Instead, I opened my laptop and began looking at the first layer of the Brooks Trust. It wasn't just cash. It was a web. My father had owned the land under the very boutiques Sutton frequented. He held the notes on the development projects Landon used to puff up his resume. By naming me trustee, he hadn't just given me money, he had given me the remote control to their lives. Every mortgage, every line of credit, every leased lifestyle they enjoyed was now a thread leading back to my workbench. The door to the shop creaked open. I didn't have to look up to know it was Tabitha. She had a specific way of walking, purposeful, grounded, the opposite of the frantic staccato of her aunts and uncles. "The lawyer called me," she said, leaning against the door frame of the office. She was wearing her university sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked tired, but her eyes were sharp. "He said I should expect a very large packet in the mail, and that you were the one I should talk to." "Sit down, Tab," I said, gesturing to the stool across from me. She sat, looking at the folders spread across the desk. "He didn't mention the others, Landon and Sutton. I assume they aren't throwing a party." "They were excused from the proceedings," I said. "Your grandfather decided they had already spent their share. He left the remainder to you, everything of value, the houses, the accounts, the land." Tabitha stared at me. She didn't look excited. She looked like someone who had just been handed a very heavy, very fragile box and told not to drop it. "And you? He left you as the trustee. Why not a bank? Why not an actual firm?" "Because a bank follows the rules," I said, leaning back. "A bank can be bargained with. A bank doesn't have a memory. Your grandfather wanted someone who remembers everything." "You," she whispered. "Me." "They're going to come for you, Dad. You know that, right? Landon isn't just going to go find a job. He doesn't even know how to use a microwave without an assistant." "Let them come," I said. "They're used to fighting people who play by the same social rules they do. They don't understand that I've spent 20 years under the chassis of cars belonging to men much more powerful than them. I know how things are put together. More importantly, I know how they come apart." We sat in silence for a while. The shop felt different now. The cars in the bays, the Porsches, the Mercedes, the Jaguars, seemed like relics of a past life. I was no longer just a man who fixed machines. I was the man who owned the factory. "What are you going to do?" Tabitha asked. "I'm going to do my job," I said. "I'm going to manage the assets. And I'm going to ensure that the people who spent their lives treating us like the help finally understand what it feels like to be unessential." She left an hour later, still processing the scale of the change. I stayed. I had work to do. Around 8 p.m., a second message arrived, this time a text from Sutton. It was a link to a social media post, a leak from an anonymous source suggesting that my restoration business was under investigation for using counterfeit parts. It was a clumsy, desperate move, the kind of thing someone does when they have no real leverage and are trying to create a fire where there isn't even smoke. I looked at the screen and felt a strange sense of calm. It was the first move in a game they didn't realize they had already lost. Sutton thought she could hurt my reputation. She didn't realize that my reputation was built on results, while hers was built on credit. I reached into the back of the file Penhaligon had given me and pulled out a digital recorder. It was a small, silver device, no larger than a thumb drive. I pressed play. My father's voice filled the room. It was thinner than I remembered, punctuated by the rhythmic hiss of an oxygen concentrator, but the clarity was absolute. "Sterling," the recording began. "If you're hearing this, then the theater in the lawyer's office is over. You've seen their faces. You've seen the way they looked at you. They think you're a tool. They think you're a utility. They've spent 40 years convinced that because you work with your hands, your mind is simple." There was a long pause, the sound of a heavy breath. "I didn't choose you because you're my son. I chose you because you're a hunter. You have the patience to wait for the right moment to strike. Landon and Sutton, they are consumers. They consume money, they consume time, they consume people. I've spent the last decade documenting exactly how they've eroded this family's foundation. In this recorder, and in the encrypted drive attached to the folder, you will find the evidence of every unauthorized withdrawal, every falsified expense report, and every private indiscretion they thought I was too old to notice." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the shop. My father hadn't just left me a fortune, he had left me a map of the enemy's fortifications. "They will try to break you, Sterling. They will try to use the law, and then they will try to use the shadows. But you have the one thing they can never understand. You have the truth, and you have the power to turn off the lights. Don't be merciful. Mercy is for people who haven't had their lives erased. Do what you do best. Restore the balance." The recording ended with a sharp click. I sat in the dark for a long time, the only light coming from the glowing icons on my laptop. I began to open the files. It was all there. Landon's consulting fees were nothing more than a kickback scheme involving the city's zoning board. Sutton's charity foundations were a shell game designed to pay for her travel and wardrobe. It was a mountain of white-collar rot, neatly organized and ready for disposal. They thought they were the ones in the penthouse, looking down at the man in the garage. They didn't realize that the penthouse was built on a foundation I now controlled. The next morning, the first counterstrike arrived. A courier delivered a thick envelope to my door. It was a formal notification of a lawsuit. Landon was suing for the removal of the trustee, citing undue influence and mental incapacity of the deceased. It was a standard opening move, meant to tie up the assets and force a settlement. He wanted me to get scared. He wanted me to see the bill for the lawyers and blink. I didn't blink. I picked up the phone and made a call to a vendor I'd known for years, a man who handled the high-end repossession of luxury assets for the banks. "Hey, Mike, it's Sterling. I have a list of vehicles that need to be recovered. All the titles are currently held by the Brooks Trust, and the lease agreements have been terminated due to a violation of the conduct clauses. I need them picked up today, publicly, especially the one at the Hayes residence." "You got it, Sterling. We'll have the trucks out by noon." I hung up. Landon's precious Italian sports car, the one he used to signify his status to the world, would be gone before lunch. It was a small move, a minor adjustment in the overall machine, but it was the first sign that the old rules were gone. I walked out into the main bay of the shop and looked at a 1954 gull-wing Mercedes that was halfway through a frame-off restoration. It was a beautiful thing, even in pieces. It required a delicate touch, a deep understanding of how every bolt and gear worked in harmony. But sometimes, when a part was too far gone, when the rust had eaten into the very heart of the metal, you didn't fix it. You cut it out. You replaced it with something stronger. Landon and Sutton were the rust. I was the blade. I picked up a wrench, feeling the cold weight of the tool in my palm. The panic was starting to form in the city. I could feel it through the wires, through the messages, through the silence of the phone. They were realizing that I wasn't going to negotiate. I wasn't going to settle. I was going to dismantle them, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the truth. As I worked on the Mercedes, my mind was already 3 moves ahead. The charity gala was in 2 weeks. It was the centerpiece of the social season, the place where Sutton performed her role as the city's premier philanthropist. It was also a Brooks-sponsored event. Or it had been. I took a deep breath, the scent of oil and old metal filling my lungs. I felt more alive than I had in years. The pressure was building, the temperature was rising, and for the first time in my life, I was the one who controlled the valve. The first rule of any complex restoration is that you never force a seized component. If a bolt refuses to turn, you don't reach for a bigger hammer. You apply heat, you apply penetrating oil, and you wait. You let the physics of expansion and contraction do the work for you. By the time I walked into my shop on Monday morning, the heat was already rising in the Brooks family circle, and I could feel the metal starting to groan. Sutton had spent the weekend trying to set my world on fire from the safety of her smartphone. The rumors she had planted about counterfeit parts in my shop had made the rounds in the local collector circles. I had received 3 calls from longtime clients, men who owned millions of dollars in rolling history, asking if there was any truth to the whispers. I didn't get angry. I didn't even sound defensive. I simply invited them to the shop to inspect their vehicles personally and offered them a full, transparent audit of my sourcing logs. When you operate with precision, a lie acts like a grain of sand in a gearbox. It might cause a momentary grit, but it eventually gets pulverized by the hardened steel of the truth. But Sutton hadn't stopped there. She had gone to the board of the upcoming charity gala, the Silver Lining auction, and suggested that my presence as the representative of the Brooks Trust would be a liability. She was trying to socially isolate me, to push me back into the shadows of the garage where she felt I belonged. She wanted me invisible so she could take the stage and claim the legacy for herself. I sat at my desk and pulled up the financial records for the gala. It was a benefit for the city's arts programs, a flashy affair held in a renovated cathedral downtown. Sutton was the chairperson. She had signed the contracts for the catering, the venue, and the floral arrangements. But looking at the fine print of the trust's accounts, I saw the flaw she had overlooked. The deposits for those contracts hadn't come from her personal accounts. They had been drawn against a bridge loan from the Brooks estate, a loan that was now under my exclusive control. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for her favorite florist. "This is Sterling Cross, trustee for the Brooks estate," I said when the owner answered. "I'm reviewing the outstanding invoices for the Silver Lining event. I see a pending payment for $20,000 in orchids and centerpieces." "Yes, Mr. Cross," the woman said, her voice sounding tight. "Ms. Pierce assured us the balance would be cleared by Friday." "I'm afraid there's been a change in the authorization," I said calmly. "The trust is currently auditing all discretionary spending. Until that audit is complete, all outgoing payments are suspended. If Ms. Pierce would like to guarantee those funds personally, she is welcome to do so. Otherwise, I suggest you hold the order." I made 4 more calls, just like that one. The caterer, the valet service, the lighting technicians, and the venue coordinator. I didn't tell them the money wasn't there. I simply told them it was being reviewed. In the world of high-end events, review is a word that causes an immediate, localized frost. By noon, Sutton's curated reality was beginning to fracture. The shop door opened around 2 o'clock. It wasn't a client. It was Sutton herself. She didn't look like the woman on the social media feeds. Her hair was slightly frantic, and her makeup looked like it had been applied in a moving car. She didn't wait for me to greet her. She marched straight into my office, slamming a designer handbag onto my desk. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed. Her voice was trembling, a high-pitched vibration that reminded me of a failing fan belt. "I'm doing my job, Sutton," I said, not looking up from the carburetor I was cleaning. "I'm managing the assets." "You're embarrassing me. I just got off the phone with the venue. They're threatening to pull the permits if the insurance bond isn't cleared by 5. You know that money is earmarked for the gala." "It was earmarked by our father," I said, setting the brass component down on a clean cloth. I finally looked at her. "He also earmarked a $4 million debt for you to settle. Since you haven't presented a plan for that repayment, I've had to tighten the belt on the estate's auxiliary spending. The gala is a luxury, Sutton, one you can't afford." "It's for charity," she shrieked. "No, it's for your image. If it were for charity, you would have used your own money, but we both know you don't have any. You've been living on the interest of a ghost for a decade." She leaned over the desk, her face inches from mine. "You think you're so smart, sitting here in your dirt and your oil. You're nothing. You're a footnote. Landon is going to win that lawsuit, and when he does, I'm going to make sure you never touch a wrench in this city again." "Landon is currently dealing with the repossession of his car," I said mildly. "I imagine he's a bit busy for legal filings today. And as for the lawsuit, undue influence is hard to prove when the deceased left a recorded statement explaining exactly why he didn't trust his other children." Sutton recoiled as if I'd slapped her. The mention of the recording was the heat hitting the bolt. I could see the panic behind her eyes, the sudden realization that I wasn't just holding the money. I was holding the narrative. "I'm not leaving until you sign those authorizations," she said, though the fire had gone out of her voice. "Then you're going to be here a long time," I replied. "I have a 300 SL coming in for a brake adjustment, and I don't like distractions while I'm working on hydraulics." She stood there for a full minute, her chest heaving, looking at the industrial surroundings with a mixture of hatred and fear. She realized then that she had no power here. In her world, shouting and status were currency. In my world, only what worked mattered. She turned on her heel and fled, the sound of her heels echoing like gunfire against the concrete floor. I went back to work. There was a rhythm to the afternoon, the hiss of the parts washer, the clink of wrenches, the low thrum of the compressor. But the day wasn't over. Tabitha stopped by after her classes. She looked concerned. She held up her phone, showing me a local news blog. Sutton is leaning into the family feud angle, Dad. She's telling people you're holding a charity event hostage to settle a personal grudge. It's getting ugly. Let it get ugly, I said, wiping my hands on a rag. Ugly is just the absence of polish. People love a scandal until they realize they're the ones paying for it. She's targeting your clients now, Tabitha warned. She's calling their wives, telling them you're unstable. I looked at my daughter. She had her mother's eyes, kind but incredibly resilient. Tab, do you know why people bring me their cars? It's not because they like me. It's because they trust me to be precise. They trust me to find the flaw that everyone else missed. Sutton is a loud noise. I am a calibrated instrument. Noise doesn't break steel. I just don't want you to lose everything you built because of them, she said softly. I'm not losing anything, I promised. I'm just clearing the workspace. That evening, I drove to Sutton's neighborhood. It was a gated community of sprawling neo-colonials, places built to look like they had history when they were really just overpriced drywall and ego. I didn't go to her front door. I parked on the street and walked to the edge of her property. Earlier that day, I had pulled a file from the Trust's archives labeled Property Maintenance, Pierce Residence. My father had been paying for the upkeep of her home for years, but he had done so through a series of third-party vendors. One of those vendors was a landscaping company that had been quietly documenting the structural issues with her retaining walls, issues she had ignored while spending the repair budget on a trip to the Amalfi Coast. I left a small manila envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a copy of the structural engineering report from 3 years ago, along with a formal notice from the Brooks Trust that the insurance policy on the home was being downgraded due to known and unmitigated hazards. Without that insurance, her mortgage would go into immediate technical default. She wouldn't be able to host her pre-gala cocktail party. She wouldn't be able to maintain the illusion of stability. I wasn't using a hammer. I was just letting the gravity she had ignored for years finally take hold. As I walked back to my truck, my phone buzzed. It was a private number. Sterling. It was Landon. He sounded exhausted, the bravado replaced by a cold, sharp desperation. Landon, how's the walking? You think you've won because you took the car? That car was a lease, you idiot. I'll have a new one by tomorrow. With what credit, Landon? I've frozen the corporate accounts associated with your consulting firm. Since the firm hasn't shown a profit in 3 years, the trust has opted to stop subsidizing the losses. You're currently in arrears with your office landlord. There was a long pause. I could hear the city traffic in the background of his end. You're overplaying your hand, Landon said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. You're making this personal. And when things get personal, people stop caring about the law. You have a daughter, Sterling. She's a beautiful girl. It would be a shame if her future got caught up in this mess. I stopped with my hand on the truck door. The air around me seemed to go still. The sarcasm, the professional detachment, the slow patience. It all compressed into a single, cold point of focus. Landon, I said, my voice as flat as a machined surface, you've spent your life thinking I'm the fixer because I'm subservient. You forgot that the man who knows how to put a machine together is the only one who knows exactly where to cut to make sure it never runs again. If you even look in Tabitha's direction, I won't go to the lawyers. I won't call the police. I will simply stop being patient. I hung up before he could respond. I sat in the truck, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The pressure was no longer just about money or legacy. The siblings had decided to change the nature of the confrontation. They thought they were the ones who could apply pressure. They thought they knew what I was capable of. I looked at the dashboard of my old truck, a vehicle I had maintained with my own hands for 2 decades. Every part was accounted for. Every system was understood. I knew exactly how much strain it could take before it broke. The charity gala was in 3 days. Sutton was expecting a coronation. Landon was expecting a settlement. They were both about to find out that when you push a patient man too far, he doesn't just push back. He redesigns the entire world until you no longer have a place in it. I started the engine. It roared to life. A perfect, synchronized explosion of power and intent. I had one more stop to make before the night was over. I needed to visit the private storage facility where my father had kept his personal collection. There was one vehicle in particular I needed to prepare, a car that hadn't seen the light of day in 20 years, but was the key to everything that was coming next. The game was no longer about restoration, it was about exposure, and I was going to make sure the whole city was watching when the lights went out. The private storage facility was located on the industrial fringe of the city, a place where the concrete was cracked and the streetlights flickered with a rhythmic uncertainty. It was a fortress of corrugated steel and high-tension wire, designed to keep the world out and the secrets in. I punched the code into the gate, a sequence of numbers that corresponded to the day I had opened my own shop, a date my father had never forgotten despite our distance. The gate slid back with a heavy metallic groan, sounding like a beast being stirred from a long slumber. Inside Unit 402, the air was stagnant, thick with the scent of mothballs and oxidized rubber. I flicked the overhead switch, and the rows of fluorescent tubes blinked to life, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the shape beneath the silk car cover. I pulled the fabric back, and the 1961 Lincoln Continental, the four-door convertible with the rear hinge doors, emerged from the shadows. It was a monolith of chrome and black lacquer, a car that looked less like a vehicle and more like a declaration of authority. This had been Harlan's pride, the car he drove when he was still building the empire, before he traded grit for the sanitized luxury of a chauffeured sedan. I spent 4 hours under the hood. I checked the fuel lines, lubricated the door hinges, and ensured the electrical system for the top was functioning perfectly. This car wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of the man Harlan Brooks had been before Landon and Sutton had begun to erode his edges. It was heavy, uncompromising, and absolutely visible. As I worked, Landon's threat from the night before hummed in the back of my mind like a low-frequency vibration. He had crossed a line. In the garage, when a tool is compromised or a lift becomes unstable, you don't ignore it. You shut down the entire operation until the threat is neutralized. The next 48 hours were a blur of calculated movements. I spent the time navigating the digital landscape of the Brooks Trust, moving pieces with the quiet focus of a grandmaster. I authorized a massive, anonymous donation to a rival charity, ensuring that the Silver Lining Gala would be overshadowed in the local press. I redirected the Trust's legal counsel to focus entirely on the zoning violations of Landon's development projects, a move that triggered a series of mandatory inspections he wasn't prepared for. Every action was a tightening of the knot, a slow-motion collapse of the walls they had built around themselves. The night of the gala arrived with a cold, biting wind that swept through the city streets. The cathedral was lit with violet and gold spotlights, casting long, dramatic shadows against the stone masonry. It was a display of opulence that felt fragile, a house of cards built on a foundation of unpaid invoices and crumbling credit. I arrived late, purposely. I didn't take the truck. I drove the Lincoln. The valet line was a parade of German engineering and Italian flair, but when the black Continental rumbled up to the curb, the air seemed to change. The car had a gravity that the modern luxury vehicles lacked. It was a ghost from a harder era. I handed the keys to a wide-eyed valet and stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of my suit. It wasn't a designer label, but it was tailored with the same precision I applied to a cylinder head. Inside, the cathedral was a cavern of noise and light. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and frantic ambition. I spotted Sutton almost immediately. She was standing near the stage, holding a glass of champagne like a weapon, surrounded by a circle of sycophants who were likely unaware that their hostess was currently in technical default on her mortgage. She saw me, and her expression shifted from a practiced social smile to a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. She whispered something to the person next to her and began to make her way toward me, her silk gown trailing behind her like a threat. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here, Sterling," she said, her voice dropping beneath the roar of the crowd. "After what you did to the vendors, people are talking. They know what you are." "They know I'm the trustee, Sutton," I said, my voice steady. "And they know that the checks they're waiting for have my signature on the line. If I were you, I'd be more concerned with the fact that the fire marshal is currently reviewing the capacity permits for this event. It would be a shame if the evening was cut short." Her face went pale under the violet lights. "You wouldn't. I don't have to. The trust has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure all sponsored events are in full compliance with city regulations. I'm just being thorough." Before she could respond, a hand clamped onto my shoulder. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Landon. I could smell the expensive scotch and the underlying scent of a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. "Outside," Landon hissed. "Now." I looked at Sutton, gave her a small, tight nod, and allowed Landon to lead me toward the side exit that opened into the multi-level parking structure. The transition from the warm, perfumed air of the cathedral to the cold, concrete silence of the garage was jarring. Our footsteps echoed against the low ceiling as Landon led me to a darkened corner on the 3rd level, far from the prying eyes of the gala attendees. "You think you're in control?" Landon spun around, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The injunction was filed this afternoon. The judge is a friend of the family. He's going to freeze your access to the trust by Monday morning. You're done, Sterling. You're going back to the grease. I leaned against a concrete pillar, my hands in my pockets. A friend of the family, Landon? You mean Judge Harrison, the man whose son's tuition was paid for by a scholarship fund that actually came from one of Harlan's silent partnerships? I've seen the ledger. If Harrison touches this case, I'll have the ethics committee on his doorstep before the sun comes up. Landon took a step toward me, his fists clenched. You think you can just blackmail everyone? You think you can just erase 40 years of how things are done in this city? I'm not erasing anything, I said. I'm restoring the original intent. Our father didn't build this to fund your failures or Sutton's fantasies. He built it to last, and he knew that as long as you two were holding the wheel, it was going to end in a wreck. He hated you, Landon shouted, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls. He told me 1,000 times that you were a disappointment. He called you a quitter because you wouldn't sit in an office and move numbers around. He didn't hate me, Landon. He was frustrated by me, because he couldn't buy me, he couldn't control me with a trust fund or a title, and in the end, that was the only thing he respected. He didn't choose me because he loved me. He chose me because he knew I was the only one who wouldn't blink when it came time to cut you out. Landon's breathing was ragged. He looked around the empty garage, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. I offered you a way out. I told you to stay away from Tabitha. You didn't listen. You're making me do things I didn't want to do. Is that right? I stepped away from the pillar, closing the distance between us. I wasn't shouting. I was speaking with the terrifying clarity of a man who had spent his life dealing with high-pressure systems. What are you going to do, Landon? You've lost your car. You've lost your credit. You're about to lose your office. You have nothing left to threaten me with but words, and your words have no value. I pulled a small, digital tablet from my inner pocket and flicked it on. The screen glowed, illuminating the space between us. This is the real-time feed of the Brooks Trust internal server, I said. I've just authorized the release of the Harlan archive to a specialized legal firm in D.C. They handle federal racketeering cases. Every kickback, every falsified development permit, every bribe you've facilitated over the last 10 years is in that file. It's not a threat, Landon. It's a scheduled event. It happens at midnight unless I enter a secondary verification code. Landon stared at the screen, his face draining of color. The reality of his situation finally hit him. He wasn't in a social spat. He wasn't in a legal battle. He was in a total system failure. You'll go down too, he whispered. The Brooks name will be ruined. I'm not a Brooks, I reminded him. I'm a Cross, my mother's name. My business is independent. My daughter's future is secure. The only thing being ruined tonight is the illusion you've been living in. The sound of music drifted out from the cathedral, a faint, mocking reminder of the party happening just a few hundred feet away. Why? Landon asked, his voice breaking. Why go this far? Because you threatened my daughter, I said. In the shop, if a part is defective, you discard it. But if a part is dangerous, if it threatens the integrity of the whole machine, you destroy it. You and Sutton are the danger, Landon. I'm just the safety protocol. I turned and began walking back toward the exit. Sterling, Landon called out, his voice echoing with a desperate, hollow sound. Wait. We can work something out. I'll drop the suit. I'll go away. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked through the heavy steel door and back into the warmth of the gala. The room was still full of people laughing and drinking, oblivious to the fact that the man who held their world together had just pulled the plug. I found Sutton in the center of the room. She was glowing, basking in the attention of a local news crew. I caught her eye and gave her a slow, deliberate smile. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the smile of a mechanic who had just finished a complex job and was watching the engine run for the first time. The midnight hour was approaching. The countdown had begun. Landon was somewhere in the darkness of the parking structure, and Sutton was on the brink of a social collapse she couldn't even imagine. I walked toward the valet stand, my work here finished. As I waited for the Lincoln to be brought around, I looked up at the stars, visible even through the city's glare. The air was cold, clean, and for the first time in 45 years, I felt like the machine was finally in balance. The morning after the gala, the city felt different, as if the atmospheric pressure had shifted overnight. I sat in my shop office, the industrial fan whirring in the corner, cutting through the heavy humidity of a brewing storm. On the small television screen mounted above my desk, the local news was a flurry of confused reporting. The Silver Lining auction had ended not with a final gavel, but with a sudden, unexplained departure of the primary organizers and a series of technical glitches that had rendered the digital bidding platform useless. To the public, it looked like a catastrophic failure of planning. To me, it looked like a machine that had been starved of oil until the piston seized. Sutton's social collapse began at approximately 10 a.m. I had released a series of formal notifications to the Gala's board of directors, detailing the exact nature of the trust's withdrawal. I didn't use inflammatory language. I simply provided the spreadsheets. The data showed that the administrative fees Sutton had been charging back to the estate were nearly triple the actual costs of the event. By noon, her phone was likely a source of constant distress. The very people who had been clamoring to be in her circle the night before were now issuing statements of deep concern regarding the financial transparency of her leadership. I watched the digital clock on my laptop. Every minute that passed was a tightening of the screws. The legal firm in D.C. had confirmed receipt of the archive. The process was now irreversible. Landon's development projects were being flagged for immediate review by the state's building commission. The foundation of his entire career, built on a series of handshakes and unrecorded favors, was being exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of a formal audit. He was no longer a power player. He was a liability. The shop phone remained silent, which was the loudest sound of all. I spent the afternoon working on the interior of a 1960s Porsche 356. The work required a steady hand and a calm mind, stretching the leather over the dashboard, ensuring every stitch was perfectly aligned. It was a meditative process, one that kept the adrenaline from clouding my judgment. I wasn't celebrating. I was finishing the job. Around 3:00 p.m., Tabitha walked into the shop. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat on the stool by the workbench and watched me work. She looked different. Older, perhaps, or just more aware of the weight of the name she carried. "It's all over the news, Dad," she finally said. "They're calling it a financial scandal. They're mentioning the Brooks name every 5 minutes." "Names are just labels, Tabitha," I said, without looking up from the dashboard. "What matters is the structure underneath. The structure was rotten. I'm just pulling down the drywall so people can see the studs." "Landon called me," she whispered. I stopped moving. The needle in my hand stayed perfectly still. "What did he say?" "He sounded small. He didn't threaten me this time. He just asked if I could talk to you. He said he'd sign whatever he needed to sign if you just stopped the release. He said he has nowhere else to go." "He had 40 years to find somewhere to go," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of any heat. "He chose to stay in a house built by someone else. Now that house is being reclaimed. It's not my responsibility to provide him with a new one." Tabitha looked at the floor. "He's family, isn't he? In some way?" "Family is a commitment to mutual integrity," I said. "It's not a permission slip to be a predator. He threatened you, Tabitha. He looked at you and saw a piece of leverage. The moment he did that, he stopped being anyone I was obligated to recognize." She nodded slowly. She wasn't arguing. She was just seeing the world for what it was, a place where actions had consequences that couldn't be smoothed over with a polite smile. She stayed for another hour, and when she left, she gave me a look that I recognized. It was the way people used to look at Harlan, with a mixture of admiration and a realization that he was a man you didn't want to be across the table from. The evening brought the storm. Rain began to lash against the corrugated roof of the warehouse, a deafening roar that drowned out the sounds of the city. I was preparing to close up for the night when a set of headlights cut through the downpour, sweeping across the shop windows. A car pulled up to the main bay door, and I heard the engine cut. It wasn't a luxury sedan, it was a taxi. Sutton stepped out of the back, her dress from the night before replaced by a simple trench coat that was already soaked through. She looked diminished. The gloss had been stripped away, leaving a woman who looked every bit of her age and every bit of her desperation. I opened the small side door and let her in. She stood in the center of the bay, the water dripping off her coat and pooling on the concrete. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked hollow. "It's gone, Sterling," she said. Her voice was barely audible over the rain. "The board met this afternoon. They've removed me from every committee. The bank called about the mortgage. They aren't even giving me 30 days. They're moving for an immediate vacancy because of the structural hazards you reported." "The report was accurate, Sutton. You knew the walls were shifting 3 years ago." "Everyone knows the walls are shifting," she screamed, the sound echoing off the metal rafters. "Everyone in this city is pretending. Why did you have to be the one to stop the music? What did we ever do to you that was so terrible?" "You didn't do anything to me," I said, leaning against the Porsche. "That was the problem. You treated me like a background process. You assumed that because I was quiet and because I worked with my hands, I didn't have a perspective. You assumed I would always be there to fix the things you broke without ever asking why you were breaking them." "We could have shared it," she sobbed. "We could have been a family." "No, you would have consumed it until there was nothing left for Tabitha. You would have spent every dime of the legacy on a life you didn't earn. I'm not the one who ruined you, Sutton. I'm just the one who stopped the subsidization of your collapse." She looked around the shop, her eyes landing on the tools, the oil pans, the half-finished machines. To her, this was a place of toil. To me, it was a place of absolute clarity. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked. "You have the jewelry Harlan gave you over the years. You have the clothes. You have a college degree you never used. I suggest you start using it. The trust will provide a small monthly allowance for basic living expenses, as long as you remain outside the city limits and make no further attempts to contact the media or the board." "A monthly allowance?" she spat, a spark of the old Sutton returning. "You're going to put me on a leash?" "It's more than you gave me for 20 years, I said. "Now I think it's time for you to leave. I have a schedule to maintain." She turned and walked back out into the rain, her silhouette disappearing into the dark. I watched the taxi pull away, its taillights fading into the gray blur of the storm. One down. I went back to the office and checked the servers one last time. The data transfer was at 98%. In less than an hour, Landon's world would officially end. There would be no trials, no long, drawn-out public dramas, just the quiet, systematic removal of his standing. He would be barred from the boardrooms. His name would be a red flag for any financial institution. He would be a man without a country, stranded in the very city he thought he owned. I felt a strange sense of completion. It wasn't the fiery vengeance of a movie. It was the satisfaction of a master mechanic who had finally balanced a vibrating engine. The noise was gone. The friction was eliminated. I turned off the shop lights one by one. The darkness swallowed the cars, the workbenches, and the tools. I walked to the front door and looked out at the street. The rain was slowing down, the clouds breaking to reveal a sliver of a cold, indifferent moon. Tomorrow, Landon would realize that the final move wasn't a legal one. He would realize that the last piece of the puzzle wasn't in the archive or the trust. It was here, in the garage. He would come to me because he had nowhere else to go. He would come for one last confrontation, thinking that he could still reach me, thinking that he could still find a flaw in my resolve. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. I had been rehearsing it for 3 decades. I locked the door and walked to my truck. The city was quiet now, the storm having washed the streets clean of the day's heat. I drove home, my mind already moving on to the final adjustments. The peak was approaching, the pressure was at its maximum, and I was the only one who knew when to release the valve. Nothing was coming next that I hadn't already accounted for. The restoration was almost complete. The finality of a mechanical failure is rarely a loud event. It is usually a small, distinct sound, a snap, a sigh of escaping air, or the sudden, absolute silence of a spinning gear losing its grip. By 10 o'clock that night, the silence in my shop was total. The storm had moved east, leaving the air outside thick and smelling of wet asphalt and iron. I hadn't gone home. I was sitting in the main bay, the overhead lights dimmed to a single amber glow over my workbench. I was waiting for the last component to arrive. I knew Landon would come. He was a man who had always believed that the world could be bargained with, provided you were loud enough or desperate enough. Now that his credit was a memory and his reputation was a scorched field, he had only one avenue left, the source of his discomfort. He couldn't go to the lawyers. I had already neutralized them. He couldn't go to his friends. They were currently deleting his contact information. He had to come here, to the garage, to the man he had spent a lifetime treating as a secondary character in his own play. When the headlights finally swept across the corrugated metal doors, I didn't move. I heard the engine of a cheap silver rental car, a far cry from the high-compression Italian engines he was used to, chatter to a halt. The door slammed. Footsteps approached the side entrance, heavy and uneven. The door flew open, and Landon stumbled in. He wasn't wearing a suit anymore. He was in a rumpled windbreaker and jeans that looked like they had been purchased in a hurry. His face was a map of exhaustion, his skin sallow under the amber light. He looked around the shop, his eyes landing on the rows of restored cars, then finally on me. "You did it," he said. His voice was cracked, a dry rattle in the stillness. "The DC firm called my office an hour ago. They're launching a full inquiry. The bank froze my personal accounts. Everything is gone, Sterling. In one day, you erased everything." "I didn't erase it, Landon," I said, my hands resting flat on the workbench. "I just stopped holding it up. You were the one who built it on a foundation of air. I just let the air out." He walked toward me, his gait swaying slightly. He stopped 10 feet away, his hands shaking at his sides. "Why? For the money? You have the trust now. You could have just taken the payout and let us be. We wouldn't have bothered you. We never bothered you before." "That's exactly the point," I said. "You never bothered to see me. You saw a service provider. You saw someone who would quietly maintain the lifestyle you enjoyed while you treated my daughter like an inconvenience and my work like a hobby. You didn't just ignore me, Landon. You ignored the reality that I was the only one in this family who actually knew how to maintain the world our father built. You're a monster, he hissed. You've ruined Sutton. She's at a motel on the interstate. She's hysterical. Does that make you feel powerful, watching your own sister lose her home? Sutton is exactly where she chose to be, I replied. She spent 3 decades living on money that wasn't hers. She's not losing a home. She's losing a stage. As for being a monster, I'm just a man who followed the manual. The manual said the parts were defective. I replaced them. Landon let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a bark. You think you've won? You think you're going to sit here in your little kingdom of scrap metal and be happy? You're alone, Sterling. You've pushed everyone away, even Tabitha. You think she's going to look at you the same way after she sees what you did to us? Tabitha is the reason the trust exists, I said, and she knows exactly who you are. She saw the way you looked at her as a bargaining chip. She doesn't need your approval, and she certainly doesn't need your version of family. She's free of you now. That's the real restoration. Landon's face twisted. The desperation was being replaced by a frantic, cornered rage. He looked around the shop, his eyes searching for something to break, something to hurt. He saw the 1961 Lincoln Continental parked in the corner, the black lacquer gleaming like a dark mirror. Harlan's car, he whispered. The only thing he ever truly cared about. You kept it for yourself, didn't you? The big prize. I kept it because it's a functional machine, I said. Something you wouldn't understand. He took a step toward the car, but I stood up, and the sheer physical presence of 20 years of industrial labor made him pause. I wasn't a tall man, but I was made of denser material than he was. Don't, I said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. What are you going to do? Landon challenged, his voice rising. Call the police? File another report? You've already taken everything. There's nothing left to lose. There is always something left to lose, Landon, I said, walking around the workbench toward him. You're currently a man with no credit, no reputation, and a very long list of people who want to talk to you about where the Brooks money went. Right now, I am the only person on the planet who is willing to provide you with a way out. He froze. A way out? I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. I set it on the hood of a nearby workbench. There is a small property in northern Maine, I said. It's a cabin, fully stocked, registered in a name you've never used. It's remote. There is no internet, no social scene, and no one who knows who Landon Brooks is. There is a bank account associated with that name, enough to keep you fed and housed for the rest of your life. It's not a mansion. It's a quiet existence. Landon looked at the key, then back at me. You're sending me into exile? I'm giving you a chance to exist without being a parasite, I said. The alternative is staying here and facing the D.C. firm. Based on the files I released, you'll be spending the next 20 years in a government facility that doesn't offer room service. The choice is yours. Take the key and go to the airport. There's a ticket waiting at the counter, or stay here and wait for the morning. Landon stared at the key. The amber light caught the notches of the brass. I could see the battle happening inside him, the pride fighting against the sheer, cold terror of the vacuum he had created. He realized then that I hadn't just dismantled his life, I had redesigned it. I had anticipated this moment, this choice, and I had prepared the only exit he could possibly take. His hand reached out, trembling, and swiped the key off the workbench. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. You're just like him, Landon whispered. You're exactly like Harlan. You don't care about people. You only care about the mechanics of the situation. Harlan was a man who didn't know how to stop the machines he built, I said. I do. Landon turned and walked toward the door. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't offer a final insult. He simply stepped out into the night, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind him with a final, definitive sound. I heard the rental car start up, the engine wheezing as it pulled away, the sound fading into the distance until there was nothing left but the hum of the city. I was alone in the shop. I walked over to the Lincoln Continental and ran my hand along the fender. The metal was cool and smooth. I had done it. The legacy was secure, the predators were removed, and the board was clear. There was no aftermath to explain, no apologies to make. The work was finished. I walked to the main power box on the wall. I looked at the rows of switches that controlled the shop, the lights, the compressors, and the security feeds. I had spent my life keeping things running, ensuring that the friction of the world didn't wear down the beauty of the machines. But every machine needs a moment of rest. Every system needs to reach its final state. I reached out and began flipping the switches. One by one, the sections of the shop went dark. The amber light over the workbench vanished. The glow from the office died. The hum of the compressor ceased. I stood in the absolute darkness of the center bay. the only light coming from the pale moon shining through the high industrial windows. I felt the silence settle into the marrow of my bones. It wasn't the silence of loss. It was the silence of a job perfectly executed. There was no need for a reflection. There was no need for a future note. The plan had been followed, the timing had been precise, and the results were irreversible. I walked to the side door and stepped out into the cool night air. I locked the door behind me, the key turning with a smooth, oiled precision that I had maintained myself. I didn't look back at the warehouse. I didn't look at the city skyline. I simply walked to my truck, my footsteps steady on the gravel. The engine of the truck turned over on the first try, a clean, powerful sound that cut through the quiet of the industrial park. I put it into gear and began to drive. The road ahead was clear, the lights of the city receding in the rearview mirror. Everything was in its proper place. The restoration was complete. I drove into the night, knowing that nothing was coming next and knowing that nothing needed to.